January 17, 1943. 30,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley. The air is thin enough to freeze spit before it hits metal. Inside the tail gunner's compartment of a B-17 Flying Fortress, Staff Sergeant Raymond C. Muller sits crouched in a space barely wider than a coffin, his breath forming ice crystals on the plexiglass dome that separates him from the void. The temperature hovers at 40 degrees below zero. His electrically heated suit has failed, again, and he can no longer feel his feet inside the fleece-lined boots. Behind him, 6 miles of empty sky. Ahead, through the narrow tunnel of the fuselage, the rest of his crew. He is the last man, the forgotten man, the one who watches the devil approach from behind while everyone else looks forward toward the target, toward home, toward survival. Then he sees them. Black specks at first, materializing from the winter haze like gnats against a gray sheet. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, 4 of them, climbing fast from the 11 o'clock low position, exactly where the B-17's defensive guns struggle to reach. Muller swings his twin 50-caliber Brownings, trying to track their closure rate, trying to calculate deflection, trying to remember the endless gunnery drills at Kingman Army Airfield, where instructors screamed about leading the target, about not chasing tracers, about staying calm. But up here, with the entire aircraft shuddering from flak bursts and the hydraulic stench of fear, staying calm is like trying to hold water in a clenched fist. He fires. A 2-second burst. Tracers arc outward in a graceful parabola that passes harmlessly beneath the lead Messerschmitt. The German doesn't even adjust course. Muller curses, swings the guns again, fires again. Another miss. The 109s are closing now, their wings beginning to sparkle with cannon fire. He can see the yellow spinner on the lead aircraft, the black crosses on silver wings. His third burst goes wide to the right. The Messerschmitt pulls up into a chandelle, rolls inverted, and comes back down like a falcon stooping on prey. Mueller knows, in that crystalline moment of clarity that combat sometimes grants, that he is about to die, that he has perhaps 15 seconds left in this world, that he has failed at the one job that mattered. But the 109 suddenly breaks off, white smoke trails from its engine cowling. Not from Muller's guns, someone else got him. Probably the ball turret gunner or the waist guns. The other 3 Messerschmitts scatter like startled crows. The formation lumbers on toward Dusseldorf, trailing smoke and prayers, 10 bombers where there had been 12 at the initial point. And Muller sits in his frozen compartment, shaking not from cold, but from the recognition of his own inadequacy. He has just fired 300 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition at attacking fighters and scored exactly 0 hits. He is, by any measure that matters in warfare, useless. This was not how it was supposed to be. When the B-17 Flying Fortress entered combat operations in 1942, it carried with it the weight of American industrial optimism and a revolutionary theory of strategic bombing. The aircraft bristled with defensive armament, up to 13 50-caliber machine guns depending on the model, covering every approach angle in overlapping fields of fire. The doctrine was elegant in its simplicity. Mass formations of heavily armed bombers would penetrate deep into enemy territory without fighter escort, their combined firepower creating a defensive sphere so lethal that intercepting fighters would be torn from the sky like paper in a hurricane. The bomber, as the theorists at the Air Corps Tactical School had preached throughout the 1930s, would always get through. The Germans had other ideas. By early 1943, Luftwaffe fighter tactics had evolved into a brutally efficient system specifically designed to crack open B-17 formations. They attacked from the front, where the bomber's defensive armament was weakest. They attacked from below, exploiting the ball turret's limited traverse rate. They attacked with cannon fire from beyond the effective range of the 50-caliber guns. And they attacked from directly astern, where a single tail gunner, isolated and alone, was often the only thing standing between a fighter's guns and the bomber's most vulnerable components, its rudder, elevators, and the thin aluminum skin protecting the men inside. The tail gunner position was simultaneously the most critical and most difficult gunnery station on the aircraft. Unlike the waist gunners or the top turret operator, who could sometimes share targets and coordinate fire, the tail gunner fought alone. Unlike the ball turret gunner, whose Sperry electromechanical computing site helped calculate deflection automatically, the tail gunner aimed using nothing but a simple ring and bead sight, the same basic technology that had guided marksmen since the advent of firearms. He had to estimate range, calculate the target's closure rate, account for his own aircraft's movement, factor in bullet drop and wind drift at altitude, and compute the proper deflection angle to place his bullets where the enemy fighter would be 2 or 3 seconds in the future, all while wearing bulky gloves in sub-zero temperatures, breathing oxygen through a mask that restricted vision, and dealing with the psychological isolation of knowing that if a fighter got past him, everyone died. The statistics were damning. Analysis of gun camera footage and combat reports from the 8th Air Force's missions over Europe in late 1942 and early 1943 revealed that tail gunners were averaging less than 1 hit per every 200 rounds fired at attacking fighters. Some gunners went through entire missions, burning through 1,000 rounds or more without scoring a single confirmed strike. The Air Force's Operational Analysis Division, staffed with statisticians and mathematicians recruited from academia, calculated that the average tail gunner had approximately a 4% chance of hitting an attacking fighter during any given engagement. 4%. A worse success rate than the notoriously inaccurate unguided rockets being developed for ground attack aircraft. This was not a training problem. The gunners going into combat had completed rigorous gunnery courses. They had fired thousands of rounds at towed targets over the Nevada desert and the Florida coast. They had memorized aircraft recognition charts until they could identify a Focke-Wulf 190 from a Messerschmitt 109 at 3 miles distance by the shape of the wing alone. They understood deflection shooting intellectually. But there was an ocean of difference between shooting at a towed sleeve moving in a predictable path at 10,000 feet on a clear day and shooting at an aircraft executing violent evasive maneuvers at 25,000 feet through broken clouds while your own bomber bucked and heaved through turbulence and flak bursts. The men were brave. The men were trained, but the men were missing, and other men were dying because of it. In the spring of 1943, at Bassingbourn Air Station in Cambridgeshire, England, a technical sergeant named Lyle Kearns began experimenting with a solution that the Air Force's engineering establishment had somehow overlooked. Kearns was not an engineer. He had been a high school physics teacher in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, before the war. He was 31 years old, ancient by aircrew standards, and had washed out of pilot training due to chronic air sickness. He had been reassigned to gunnery school, where his tendency to overanalyze problems made him an exceptional student, but a mediocre combat gunner. During his first 5 missions as a tail gunner, he had fired 1,147 rounds at enemy fighters and achieved 0 confirmed hits. He knew he was going to die if something didn't change. The problem, as Kearns saw it, was not aim. It was perception. The tail gunner's position forced him to crouch or kneel facing rearward, neck craned at an unnatural angle to look through the plexiglass, with his eyes only inches from the optical ring sight. This severely restricted his peripheral vision and made it nearly impossible to track multiple targets or spot fighters approaching from below before they entered his field of fire. He was essentially looking through a straw while trying to defend against threats that could materialize from anywhere in a 180-degree hemisphere. By the time he acquired a target and began tracking, the fighter had already closed to firing range and had the initiative. The gunner was always reacting, never anticipating, always behind the curve of the tactical situation. What if, Kearns wondered, he could see more? Not just the narrow cone directly behind the aircraft, but the entire approach pattern? What if he could spot fighters earlier, begin tracking them earlier, and have his guns positioned in their path before they opened fire. He found his answer in the side mirror of a wrecked British lorry sitting in a maintenance yard near the base perimeter. Kearns spent 3 days experimenting with different angles and positions, using bits of wire and scrap metal to rig the mirror to the interior frame of his gunnery station. The final configuration was absurdly simple. A 6-inch circular convex mirror mounted on an articulated arm, positioned just above and to the left of his ring sight, angled to give him a fish-eye view of the entire lower hemisphere behind and below the aircraft. It looked like something a teenage farm boy might bolt onto a hot rod, not a piece of military equipment bound for combat at the edge of space. His fellow gunners thought he was insane. The pilots thought he was a superstitious fool engaging in magical thinking, like the men who wore lucky socks or refused to fly without a photo of their sweetheart tucked in their flight jacket. The engineering officer at Bassingbourn told him flatly that the mirror would ice over at altitude and become useless, or that the vibration would make the reflection too blurred to provide useful information, or that it would simply distract him from his primary sight picture. But Kearns had run out of options. He had the mirror mounted in his station before the next mission, and he went up over Germany with his homemade modification secured with nothing but baling wire and faith. April 17, 1943. Target: Focke-Wulf Aircraft Assembly Plant at Bremen. Heavy fighter opposition expected. At 08:47 hours, 40 minutes from the initial point, Kearns spotted them in his mirror. 3 Messerschmitts, still 2 miles out and 1,000 feet below, beginning their attack run. They were barely visible as dark blurs against the winter farmland of Lower Saxony, but the mirror's convex surface compressed the view just enough that they registered as movement before they would have been visible through his normal sight line. Kearns swung his guns down and waited, tracking their climb, his fingers resting lightly on the triggers. The lead Messerschmitt pulled up into his normal field of view, and Kearns was already there, already compensating for deflection, already firing. The fighter flew directly into his stream of tracers at 800 yards. 50 caliber rounds tore through the 109's thin belly armor, through the fuel tank, through the engine block. The German pulled away trailing black smoke and did not return. The other 2 broke off their attack before reaching firing position. Kearns had just achieved what most tail gunners never accomplished in an entire tour, forcing attacking fighters to abandon their run before getting off a shot. One mission earlier, he had been statistically useless. Now, with a mirror that cost nothing and weighed less than a pound, he had become effective. Word spread through the barracks faster than rumors of a USO show. Gunners from other crews cornered Kearns in the mess hall, in the briefing room, in the latrine. They wanted to know about the mirror. They wanted to know if it really worked or if he'd just gotten lucky. They wanted to know where to find their own. Within 2 weeks, at least 15 tail gunners in the 91st Bomb Group had fabricated their own versions of Kearns's mirror system, each one slightly different, each one customized to the individual gunner's preferences and physical position in the cramped compartment. Some used flat mirrors, some used convex, some mounted them on fixed brackets, some on articulated arms, but all of them served the same purpose: expanding the tail gunner's situational awareness from a narrow cone to a wide hemisphere, buying precious seconds of early warning that could mean the difference between life and death at closing speeds of 500 miles per hour. The No. Engineering Establishment at 8th Air Force. Headquarters initially resisted official recognition of the modification. There was no technical manual describing it. It had not been tested under controlled conditions. It had not been approved by the Wright Field Development Center or the Air Materiel Command. It was a field modification, improvised by enlisted men, and the institutional Air Force had a deep suspicion of anything that bypassed the proper channels of research, development, testing, and evaluation. The fact that it worked was almost beside the point. The system had its own logic, its own processes. and a tail gunner in England taping a mirror to his gun station did not fit anywhere in that system. But the men kept dying, and the men with mirrors kept living, and eventually the statistical evidence became impossible to ignore. In May 1943, the 8th Air Force's Operational Analysis Division conducted a formal study of defensive gunnery effectiveness across 12 bomb groups operating from bases in East Anglia. They examined gun camera footage, interrogated gunners after missions, analyzed ammunition expenditure rates, and compiled reports on fighter attacks and bomber losses. The data was clear enough to convince even the most skeptical staff officer. Tail gunners using improvised mirror systems were achieving hit rates approximately 2.8 times higher than gunners using standard ring and bead sights alone. The mirrors didn't make the gunners shoot more accurately. Bullet placement still depended on the gunner's skill at deflection shooting. But they allowed gunners to begin engaging targets earlier in the attack sequence, which meant more rounds on target, which meant more hits, which meant more fighters damaged or destroyed or forced to break off their attacks prematurely. The early warning provided by the mirrors effectively tripled the tail gunner's combat effectiveness. By autumn 1943, the modification had spread throughout the 8th Air Force and had jumped across to the 15th Air Force operating from bases in Italy. Air Service Command depots began fabricating standardized mirror kits using proper aviation-grade materials and mounting hardware. The modification was added to maintenance checklists. New gunners arriving as replacements were trained on its use. The improvised field modification had become official doctrine, winding its way backward through the bureaucracy until the system finally acknowledged what the men at the sharp end had known for months: that sometimes the best engineering comes not from laboratories and wind tunnels, but from terrified men in desperate situations who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things must be. The Germans noticed. Luftwaffe intelligence officers, interrogating captured American airmen, specifically asked about the mirrors. They wanted to know how widespread their use was, whether they were standard equipment or individual modifications, what advantage they provided. German fighter pilots reported that tail gunner engagement ranges had increased noticeably by late 1943, and that attacks from the 6 o'clock position were becoming significantly more dangerous. Some Jagdgeschwader began modifying their tactics accordingly, approaching from steeper angles or using cloud cover to mask their attack runs until they were closer. The mirrors had changed the calculus of the air battle over Europe, if only by a few percentage points, but in a war of attrition where every advantage mattered. A few percentage points meant hundreds of lives saved. Hundreds of bombers that made it back to England. Thousands of tons of bombs that reached their targets. But the mirror was never just about gunnery. It was about perception, about seeing, about the fundamental human need to understand what is behind us, what pursues us, what threatens us from the blind spots we cannot cover with our limited biological vision. The tail gunner, alone in his plexiglass compartment at the edge of the formation, was engaged in an ancient struggle, the struggle of the hunted to become the hunter, of the prey to transform into predator, of the defensive position to become offensive capability. The mirror gave him something more valuable than improved accuracy. It gave him agency. It gave him the feeling, however illusory, that he was not merely reacting to attacks, but anticipating them, that he was not helpless, but empowered, that he had some control over his fate in a war that reduced most men to anonymous components in vast mechanical systems they could neither influence nor escape. Staff Sergeant Raymond Mueller, who had crouched in his frozen compartment over the Ruhr Valley in January 1943 and discovered his own inadequacy, completed his 25th and final mission on November 3, 1943, and returned to the United States. He had fired approximately 31,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition during his tour. He was credited with 2 confirmed fighter kills and 4 probables. He survived. In his after-action reports, meticulously filed in archives that would not be declassified for decades, He noted that the mirror modification gave him the ability to see death coming in time to do something about it. The phrasing was awkward, unpoetic, the kind of utilitarian language that enlisted men use when they're not trying to impress anyone. But it captured something essential about the experience of aerial combat in the Second World War. The constant presence of death, always approaching, always searching for the gap in the defenses, and the desperate human effort to see it, to anticipate it, to hold it at bay for just a little longer. The mirror became a symbol of something larger than its tactical application. It represented the peculiarly American approach to warfare that would define the conflict. The willingness to modify, to adapt, to disregard established procedure when procedure proved inadequate, to trust the judgment of the men doing the actual fighting rather than the men studying maps in headquarters. The Germans had Prussian military precision, rigid tactical doctrine, and a strategic culture that valued adherence to plan above adaptation to reality. The Japanese had Bushido, spiritual fervor, and a willingness to die that Western military analysts struggled to comprehend. The British had tradition, sang-froid, and an institutional memory of empire that taught them how to endure. But the Americans had mirrors bolted together in maintenance, yards by farm boys and high school teachers who refused to accept that a 4% hit rate was good enough. They had mechanics who modified aircraft in ways that violated technical orders but saved lives. They had pilots who threw away the manual and figured out through trial and error how to coax another 10 miles per hour out of their aircraft, or another 1,000 feet of altitude, or another hour of fuel endurance. They had a military culture that was simultaneously chaotic, undisciplined, inefficient, and maddeningly creative. A culture that could produce both catastrophic failures of planning and miraculous improvisations that changed the course of battles. Technical Sergeant Lyle Kearns survived the war. He returned to Cedar Rapids, returned to teaching physics, and never spoke publicly about his mirror modification. In the 1960s, when historians researching the air war over Europe tracked him down and asked about it, he seemed genuinely surprised that anyone cared. It was just a mirror, he said. Just a simple piece of glass that let him see a little bit more than he could see before. Anyone could have thought of it. Anyone could have done it. He didn't understand why it mattered. But it did matter. It mattered to the men who flew with mirrors in their tail gun stations and came home. It mattered to their wives, their children, their grandchildren, who would never have existed if those men had died in the frozen sky over Germany. It mattered to the historians who study the minutiae of technological development and try to understand how wars are won not just through grand strategy, but through 10,000 small innovations compounded across 10,000 desperate situations. And it matters now, decades after the last B-17 made its final landing, because it tells us something about what happens when ordinary people are placed in impossible circumstances and refuse to accept impossibility as an answer. The mirror, that absurdly simple device, that piece of salvaged automobile glass, that field modification that weighed less than a candy bar, tripled tail gun accuracy not through any revolutionary technology, but through the simple expedient of allowing men to see, and in seeing, to anticipate, and in anticipating, to act, and in acting, to survive. The engineers at Wright Field could have discovered this principle through systematic analysis and controlled testing. They could have issued mirrors as standard equipment from the beginning. They could have incorporated expanded situational awareness into the design requirements for defensive gun stations. But they didn't, because they were thinking about guns and sights and ballistics, about the mechanics of killing. They were not thinking about perception, about the psychological state of a man crouched in a metal coffin watching death approach from behind. They were not thinking about fear, about helplessness, about the crushing weight of being the last line of defense for 9 other men whose lives depended on your ability to aim straight under conditions that made accuracy nearly impossible. The American way of war, distilled down to its essence, was visible in that mirror. Not the industrial capacity that built 12,000 B-17s. Not the strategic vision that targeted ball-bearing plants and oil refineries. Not the logistics network that moved men and materiel across the Atlantic. But the willingness of a high school physics teacher from Iowa to look at a failed system and say, "I can fix this. I can make this better. I can survive." And the cultural ecosystem that allowed that fix to propagate, to spread, to eventually become doctrine, despite institutional resistance and bureaucratic inertia. There were no medals for Lyle Kearns, no commendations, no mention in the official histories published immediately after the war. His name does not appear in the popular accounts of the air war over Europe. He received no patent, no financial compensation, no recognition beyond the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had solved a problem that better men than him had failed to solve. In the cold mathematics of military effectiveness, he saved more American lives than most fighter aces, prevented more bomber losses than most tactical innovations, and changed the nature of aerial combat more than most technological developments. And he did it with a mirror from a truck. In the decades after the war, as air combat evolved into missile engagements beyond visual range and defensive gunnery became obsolete, the lessons of the tail gunner's mirror faded into historical footnote. Modern fighter pilots sit in cockpits surrounded by radar displays and heads-up displays and threat warning receivers that provide 360-degree situational awareness through electronic sensors. They can see threats miles beyond the range of human vision, through clouds and darkness, with precision that would seem like magic to Raymond Mueller or Lyle Kearns. The technology has changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental principle remains the same. In combat, the side that sees first acts first. The side that can perceive the threat before the threat perceives them holds the initiative. The side that can expand awareness beyond the natural limits of human biology gains an advantage that multiplies force effectiveness beyond the simple addition of more weapons or more men. The mirror tripled tailgun accuracy. But what it really did was restore agency to men who had been reduced to passive defenders, reactive targets, statistical casualties waiting to happen. It transformed them from victims of geometry and physics into active participants in their own survival. It gave them hope, in a place where hope was the scarcest resource of all. And that, perhaps, is the real story. Not the technical details of deflection shooting or ammunition expenditure rates or fighter attack profiles, but the story of what happens when you give men the tools to see their enemy approaching and the time to do something about it. The story of improvisation born from desperation. The story of institutional systems that eventually, grudgingly, adapted to accommodate the wisdom that emerged from the sharp end of combat. The story of a democracy at war, messy and inefficient and wasteful and chaotic, but ultimately more adaptable than its authoritarian enemies, because it was willing to listen to high school teachers from Iowa who had better ideas than the generals and engineers in their headquarters. The B-17 flying fortresses are gone now, most of them cut up for scrap metal in the years after the war. Their aluminum recycled into automobiles and refrigerators and lawn furniture. The men who flew them are nearly all gone too, 90 years old or more, their memories fading like old photographs in sunlight. The air bases in East Anglia have been returned to farmland or converted to civilian airports or preserved as museums where tourists can walk through restored aircraft and try to imagine what it was like to fly into the flak-filled sky over occupied Europe at 23 years old with a mirror bolted to your gun station and faith that you might see tomorrow. But the mirror remains, in the archives and the technical manuals and the historical record, as a monument to human ingenuity under pressure. as evidence that sometimes the most important innovations come not from laboratories, but from mechanics' sheds. That sometimes the difference between life and death is measured not in tons of bombs or numbers of aircraft, but in the ability to see around corners, to anticipate threats, to transform defensive vulnerability into offensive capability through nothing more than a piece of glass, and the refusal to accept that the way things are is the way things must be. In January 1943, Raymond Muller sat in his frozen compartment and fired 300 rounds at attacking fighters and hit nothing. In April 1943, Lyle Kearns looked in a mirror and saw death climbing up from below in time to do something about it. Between those two moments lies the entire story of how ordinary men, facing extraordinary circumstances, find extraordinary solutions. Not through superior technology or industrial might or strategic genius, but through the simple human capacity to observe, to analyze, to improvise, and to refuse to surrender to the tyranny of inadequate systems. The mirror tripled tail gun accuracy, but it did something more important than that. It proved that vision matters more than firepower, that awareness matters more than ammunition, that the ability to see what is coming, to perceive the threat before it becomes fatal, to expand consciousness beyond the narrow tunnel of immediate crisis. That ability, more than any weapon or any doctrine or any technology, is what separates the survivors from the casualties in the oldest and most permanent of human endeavors. And in the end, that is what we remember. Not the tonnage of bombs dropped, or the number of fighters shot down, or the industrial statistics that historians compile into tables and graphs, but the image of a man in a frozen compartment, looking into a salvaged mirror, seeing death approach, and having just enough time, just barely enough, to do something about it. That is the victory that matters. That is the triumph that endures. That is the evidence, written in survival rates and mission reports, and the lives that continued past 1943. That human ingenuity deployed in the service of human survival can overcome any obstacle, no matter how lethal, no matter how inevitable it may seem. The mirror was just a mirror, but it was also a window into something larger, a reflection, if you will, of the democratic spirit, improvisational, pragmatic, willing to try anything, resistant to authority that cannot justify itself through results, insistent that the men doing the dying have the right to determine how they will fight. In that piece of salvaged glass, we can see the entire American character in wartime, with all its strengths and all its contradictions. The willingness to discard doctrine when doctrine fails. The trust in individual initiative over institutional procedure. The belief that any problem, no matter how complex, can be solved if you look at it from the right angle. 30,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley, a man looks into a mirror and sees his enemy approaching. He swings his guns to meet the threat. He fires. The enemy breaks away. He survives. And in that survival, purchased through vision and initiative and a refusal to accept inadequacy, we find the true measure of what it means to fight a war, not just with bombers and bullets, but with mirrors that let us see around corners, into blind spots, past the limitations that others accept as inevitable. That is the lesson. That is the legacy. That is the truth that emerges from the frozen sky over Germany in 1943, reflected in a piece of salvaged glass, preserved in the historical record, waiting for us to understand. We survive not because we are stronger or braver or more willing to die, but because we are willing to see, and in seeing, to act, and in acting, to change the outcome. One mirror, one gunner, one moment of clarity purchased through improvisation and desperation. And the world, by some small but measurable degree, becomes a different place.